Joined on the phone today by author Warren Zanes and talking about his new book, Petty, the Biography. How are you today, Warren?
Good. How are you?
I am excellent. It's great to be speaking with you today.
All right. Well, that goes both ways. You're in Minnesota.
Yeah, can you tell by the accent?
No, I can't. Can you tell I'm in New Jersey by the accent?
Well, now that you mention it a little bit. Well, first of all, the book, Petty, the Biography, it seems like Tom Petty is kind of a guy that really hasn't opened up a lot about his life in the past. So is this really kind of like the tell-all book for him?
I don't know if I would call it tell-all because, he is a very deep guy, and there are always more stories there. But this definitely does mark a shift because it hasn't been his practice to swing open the doors quite like he did here. And, I'm the lucky guy who was standing there with a pen and a notebook. And it was remarkable, really, when we got into the process, which extended over years. He was more unguarded than I thought he was going to be.
Well, and I know you toured with him, way back in the 80s, the early 80s, so it must be weird to kind of go full circle and now be writing this book all these years later.
Well, it was an amazing turn of events for me, because even before going on tour with him, I was a big fan. From the first record, I was 11 years old. We heard Breakdown on WBCN in Boston, and we never missed a release. He was always the guy. When I was in a band, we were in a kind of punk rock scene, and we played shows with groups like X. Yeah, so no matter what we were listening to, what community we were in, we always had a connection to Tom Petty, and we were pretty vocal about it. When I was in the Fuegos, we were on a regular basis talking about how much we admired Tom Petty. And eventually we got to meet him, and he took us out on tour. But I have to say, at that point in time, I was, a kid with a chipped front tooth in a rock and roll band. I am absolutely sure he didn't see me as his biographer. So I left the music business and went to school for 12 years. And it was at the end of that my kind of second chapter in my relationship with Tom Petty started, when he read a book that I wrote and reached out, made contact.
Well, it seems like to the average person, Tom Petty has kind of like a nice guy sort of vibe. Doesn't seem like a guy that would have a lot of skeletons in his closet, I guess. But, I'm sure there must have been some interesting stuff that you unearthed that maybe you didn't realize.
Yes, certainly. And even what was in his closet, I wouldn't say it was so much skeletons. Heroin use was big news. That a lot of headlines featured that in the weeks before release. But Tom Petty was never a guy who lived his life in the tabloids. He's been a song guy and a record guy and a band guy. So a lot of what came out in the book related to being in a band, keeping a band together. And they're coming up on 40 years here. And it's not easy to pull that one off. And it means that things have gone on, that he had to make decisions along the way that made him unpopular with his own band. And those are the kind of things that hadn't been talked about publicly. But he's a very intuitive, and I would even say remarkable, band leader. And that gets a lot of coverage in the book. The heroin use, that came after he had done Wildflowers and after he had toured behind Wildflowers. And he ended a marriage that was approaching 20 years, and he had 2 kids, one of whom was college age, one in her teens, and his life slowed down as a recording artist just long enough that he really felt the crash. And I think it was the first time in his adult life that he couldn't control what was going on around him, to the degree that he had been able to up to that point. And he was in a kind of pain that I don't think he uses it to justify heroin use, but it certainly helps the reader to understand where he was. It was not casual.
Yeah, it is interesting to think. I know Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers really had a lot of success, real early on and for, decades. And a lot of people kind of have their problems early on when they see success like that right off the bat, but he kind of had it maybe towards, not the end of his career, but definitely down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point there, because they were so focused on career and art that, in a way, it kept them out of the kind of trouble that other young acts get into and don't survive. So the art was the ferry that got them through for a long time. But it doesn't matter how famous, how successful you get. The life and its challenges, everybody gets their share of that. And he got his share, of the bulk of it at one point in time. And it almost marks a before and after in this remarkable career of his.
Yeah, and again, the book is called Petty, the Biography, and we're on the phone today with author Warren Zanes. And I'm guessing you probably spent a lot of time with Tom Petty doing the research for the book. What actually went into the making of it?
Well, as you suggest, the core of it was just time with Tom. The two of us sitting at, we would go to the lounge outside his recording studio in Malibu and, would do a couple hours, break for a meal, talk during our meal, go back, do a few more hours, and it was several years of that. And then between the sessions that I did with him, I would be doing interviews with other principals in this story, which would always kick up some new information that I'd then return to Tom with. And so there's a lot of back and forthing, and you're talking about an artist whose interviews are typically 20 minutes to 3 hours long, and they're focused on whatever project he's releasing. So suddenly, he's having conversations that are going hours, extending over years, and it definitely sets a different mood, and it becomes something more like, however much this is a professional relationship, it becomes something more like friends talking. And I think that's another reason. He made a decision to talk more openly about his life, but the situation certainly encouraged that.
Well, I got to ask you, as you mentioned, you've been a Tom Petty fan for, since the early days, and now you consider him to be a friend. What do you think it is about his music, I guess, that makes it so timeless and is able for, people who were with him early on to enjoy, and still, kids in high school nowadays loving his stuff?
Well, I put him in a class with writers like Buddy Holly and Hank Williams, who have an ease to their songs. You listen to it, and it feels like the song must have just fell out of them. Now, anybody who writes songs knows that it may happen sometimes, but generally there's a lot of work involved. But the songs give off that sense. But more important than that, I think, for lack of a better way of describing it, it's just the emotional truth at the center of these songs. From American Girl, when people hear American Girl, she was an American girl raised on promises. You've got the makings of an American epic in the first line, and I think it was kind of wide open for identification amongst his listeners, and he's kept that up.
I think, too, when you look through, the 80s and into the 90s, he was another guy. Not only was the music so important, but his music videos, I think, were also very creative and usually don't, maybe a Michael Jackson or somebody like that, but usually don't get both.
Yeah, well, I think what it shows is that Tom Petty's got a very keen mind and a very keen sense of humor. Make no mistakes, the slow Southern drawl is just the front of the store, behind which is a mind that's moving very quickly. And I think if he weren't such a funny guy, he wouldn't have attracted people like Johnny Cash and George Harrison and Bob Dylan. But he's not just a bright musical mind. He's got the humor, and he's got the kind of speed of his thinking. And when you take an artist like that and you put him in almost any context, whether it's video or what have you, things are going to go pretty well. And so people might have thought, that's curious, Tom Petty, video artist. But he could go more wide in terms of his creative work than I think anyone gives him credit for.
So with that being said, do you think we'll ever see another Tom Petty or somebody like that, or is he kind of maybe the last of a dying breed in the music biz?
I hate to give the negative forecast because I can guarantee you that right now something interesting is happening out on the margins where we can't see, and we're going to hear about it in the next couple of years. That said, it was a different time. He shook Elvis Presley's hand. He played with Bob Dylan and George Harrison. He made records with Johnny Cash. He had his first #1 album at 64 years of age. It's hard to imagine that another artist is going to come along and have an experience like that. So he's got this. He represents the full arc of the rock and roll era, and some great stuff will happen. Will we have an arc like that? Hard to imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's all in the book of Petty, the biography, and we're on the phone with author Warren Zanes. And I know you have always a lot of stuff going on. Is there something maybe that's next for you or another project in the works?
Well, I'm thinking about another book, and in the earliest phases of that. I'm too superstitious to share what I'm thinking about. But I've been working on a project with Stephen Van Zandt, who's in the Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band, and known for his Sopranos work and his radio show. And he came up with this idea for a middle and high school history of rock and roll curriculum that is not so much music department based as social studies based. And we've been working on that for a while. You can see it at teachrock.org. And I consider that part of all the stuff I do. I look forward to a day where my kids bring home a social studies book and you look in it and you see Beatles on Ed Sullivan and you see the garage band era and guys like Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen are stories that get told in the classroom. So that project is certainly something that has that spirit in it.
Yeah, that sounds awesome for sure. And, of course, I'm guessing Tom Petty will probably have his own chapter when that comes out.
He earned it.
Well, again, Warren Zanes, author of the book Petty, the biography, and thanks a lot for being on with us today. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.